All right, so today we are going to continue talking about loops and our conversation with loops. So when it comes to loops, we just talked about what loops were last week. Often you want to use loops when you have to repeat a task. So do something over and over and over again. So an example I gave was to print out the asterisk 100 times on separate lines. But instead of you physically copying and pasting and printing out the asterisk 100 times, there has to be an easier way to do it. So we introduced the loop. So the loop is, well, I don't have the definition here, but I will write it down for you, is, time out 1 second. The loop is used when you have a block of code that you want to repeat. So instead of you copying and pasting that block of code and having it print over and over and over again, what you're going to do instead is just have this block of code and have it run multiple times, as opposed to you just having it list multiple times, having it written multiple times. It's also used for iterating over a sequence. This right here, we're going to be talking about later when we cover strings and when we cover lists. But we haven't gotten that far quite yet in Python. So we will return back to this specific kind of loop later on when we get to that topic. So when you think about a loop, you want to think of a loop as if you're talking to someone in English and giving them instructions. So instead of me just saying print the asterisk 100 times, if you want to convert it into a more code logical way of thinking it, you want to say, we want to print the asterisk while we have less than 100 printed, or 100 asterisks printed. Something like that. So instead of just saying print 100 times, you want to think print asterisk while we have less than 100 asterisks printed. That keyword while is going to be huge for our concept today. This is called a while loop after all. So for the while loop, we have a condition that follows the word while. So while, in our case, we talked about conditions for like 3 weeks now. It's kind of like an if statement, but instead of an if, we have while. So while this condition is true, keep going. So in our case, it's while we have less than 100 asterisks printed, this would be your condition that is following the word while. But with a while loop, you don't only want a condition. On top of the condition, you also want an action, something being done every single time you are running, like every single time this condition is true. So while you have less than 100 asterisks printed, we want to print the asterisk. This would be our action as opposed to the condition. So I also briefly touched on the 4 components of a loop. I want to talk about them again and also go into these in a little bit more detail than just defining it for you. So first off, we have the counter initialization. So the counter initialization is going to be whatever you initialize, so a variable that you create so that you're able to keep track of how many times your loop has run. So it could be one variable or it could be multiple variables that keep track of the number of repetitions for your loop. So it could be one, it could be multiple, for most of our class, for a lot of our class actually, we are going to be only using one variable, but you could definitely have multiple. Then we have our condition. So the condition typically involves our counter initialization, but it'll determine if the loop should run again or not. So going to our code down here, we have first off our counter initialization. This right here, we have created our variable. This is our counter initialization. It's our variable that will keep track of the number of repetitions of our loop. And we know that this is a counter initialization because it's being used specifically inside of our condition. So this is our condition down here, count is less than 100. So while count is less than 100, this is our condition. As soon as count is no longer less than 100, then you stop. The next thing I'm going to introduce in terms of our components is our body. So the body is kind of like, this is your action pretty much. What you want to do in the case your while condition is true. So like what executes during that iteration. So here, this thing right here, that would be our body or our action. This is what is going to execute in the case your condition, your for or your while loop condition is true. And finally, we have an incrementer or a decrementer. So this right here, increment means to increase by one or actually just increase. Decrement means to decrease. So this is going to update your counter so that you can avoid a loop or an infinite loop. So let's actually talk about an infinite loop, and I want to show you guys an infinite loop. It could be a little nasty sometimes, to be honest, but an infinite loop is just a loop that runs forever and ever and ever. In the case you're lucky, your computer will be able to detect if you have an infinite loop or not, and then it'll your code stop it prematurely so that it's not running forever. Sometimes your computer won't detect it and it will literally continue to run until it can't run anymore. So let me show you an example of an infinite loop. And the infinite loop, once again, can occur if you have any of the 4 components that are missing. It actually depends. Sometimes if you're missing a certain component, you'll just get an error. And then sometimes if you're missing a different component, you'll get an infinite loop. So let me just show you an infinite loop. Let me switch over. Everyone can see my screen okay? Okay, perfect. So we're just gonna talk, I'm just gonna give you an example of the infinite loop. I'm going to write the same exact code that I had before. So count equals 0. Remember, this is our condition, or not a condition, a counter. I've created my counter. I started at 0 because so far from the very beginning, from my starting point, I have 0 asterisk printed. And I want to, my condition is I want to keep printing while count is less than 100. So my condition is to print while we have less than 100 asterisk printed. Now for the body of the loop, I want to continuously print the asterisk. And normally when you count, normally we had this right here. This is our incrementer. The increment counts by 1. Increment / update counts by 1. Here, however, this is just our body. This is our action. So if I run this, oops, this should be Python. You could see it prints out 100 asterisks and then it stopped. You can see that it stops because now it's not moving any further lower. You could see that my scroll bar is just right here, and I can scroll up and down, and here I have, this is like asking me to, it's prompting me to run another body of code. If I get rid of this count is equal to count plus 1. Notice that actually it's going forever. It hasn't stopped yet. I haven't, it's, okay, you know, I'm gonna stop this because, so I stopped it myself, but let's look at the number of asterisks that I've printed. So it's quite literally an infinite loop. It hasn't stopped until I've manually forced it to stop. That's the amount of damage that you can do because I'm missing one of the 4 components. So if you realize, oh, like my code is still running even though it should have stopped, then you want to take a look at it and then see if you're missing any of those 4 components. And we're going to be doing a lot of practice with this today. So hopefully by the end of today, you have a better grasp of the concept. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint and we're just going to keep going from there. All right. So some notes about the while loops. The condition is evaluated first. When you create your loop, we have, this is our counter again, this is our counter initialization. But when we go straight in, everything is run sequentially. But the exception is when you're going with loops, because loops, once you reach the bottom, it'll go back up here to your starting point. So it'll check my condition first, then run the body, run the increment or decrement or wherever it lies in the body, and then it'll go back up here and evaluate the condition again. When it evaluates the condition, then it'll see if it's true or false. If it's true, it'll go through the loop again. If it's false, however, it'll completely ignore everything in the body, kind of like an if statement, and then it'll start from here, skip the body, and then just continuously go on, never returning to the while loop again unless it's within another while loop. So pretty much, once again, let me just clear everything from here. Condition is going to be evaluated first. So it checks this condition. If it's true, then it'll run through the entirety of whatever's been indented over. However, if it's false, it'll skip over past the body or past the indentation code block, and then it'll move on, moving on to the next code block in the sequence. Let's go back to the case that if it was true. So if it's true and it reaches the end, it doesn't just move on. It has to go back to the top and evaluate if it's true or false, if that condition is true or false. If it's true, it'll run through the code again. And then it's just a cycle until it reaches a position where that condition is no longer true. If the condition is no longer true, then it will, once again, just move to the very bottom or like outside of that loop, and it will run the next code block after that condition or after the while loop. The structure of a while loop is very similar to an if statement. So if you see everything indented over, so all of this stuff that's indented over, that is part of your body or like the code block that you have to execute in the case your condition is true, just like if you had an if statement. Normally for your if statement, you had your condition And then after that, like all right here would be your code block, everything indented over. If you have more code written after it that's not indented, that is aligned with the if statement, then you know that that's not part of the block that you have to execute in the case the condition for the if statement is true. So the structure is very similar. So that's the reason why we did the if statements first, and then we are doing the loops now. Speaking of if statements, actually, one way to think of a while loop is as a repeating conditional. So as a repeating if statement, if you would. So when you think about how to implement a loop, think about the question, think about the problem. Try to rewrite it in terms of until some condition is true. So until something is true, because that's the same thing as saying while some condition is not true. So you want to think of it in a way that you could translate it into a loop. And that's the kind of practice that we are going to be doing today. So these are the things I'm hoping to go over today. If we don't go over it today, that's okay. We could just pick it up next week. The first algorithm that I want to go over is printing out values 1 through 100. So you don't want to physically print, like you don't want to write out print 1, print 2, print 3, print 4, print 5. That's 100 different things you have to write. So that's 100 lines of code potentially. But we're going to use loops to do this. Then we're going to count down from 100 to 0. So 100, 99, 98, 97, 96. But we're going to do that next. Once again, potentially you could have 100, 100, 101 lines of code. So we're going to use while loops. Then we're going to print out even numbers from 2 through 100. So 2, 4, 6, 8, all the way up to 100. Then we're going to try asking for user input 10 times. So instead of writing like input, give me a number 10 times, we're just going to ask them in the form or within a loop instead. Next algorithm, asking for numerical input until the user inputs a number that is a multiple of 10. So notice that keyword until that we talked about. So this is also something we're gonna have to translate into a while loop. And the last one is Fizzbuzz. Fizzbuzz is, like, I would say, like a pretty well-known coding question when it comes to just the computer science world. So we'll be able to do that as well. There's a lot of other loop algorithms that we can do. However, we're only going to focus on these because this is also our first day. Like this is a very introductory level, or just like an introduction to loops at this point. So we'll just do these. If we don't finish, we'll pick it up next week. So we're going to print out values 1 through 100. Oh, I actually wrote 0 here. So we can ignore that 0 because I'm going to start from 1. But we want to, when you think about a loop, you want to think about the 4 different components for a loop. So if you remember the 4 different components for a loop, we first have the counting initialization. Then we had our condition. Then we had like our body or action. And then we had like an updater. So our incrementer or decrementer, that's what we're going to talk about in just a moment. Another way you could also think about each of these is what's your starting value, what's your ending condition, action, increment, or decrement. So we're going to fill these out one at a time before I go into filling out or just writing out the code. So first of all, your starting value. Where do you want to start? So think about what your task is and tell me where we should start. So what is our counter going to be equal to? Any ideas? We want to start at 1. 1 is the first number that we want to print. First thing to print. So that's our start. So that would be our starting value. Counter is equal to 1. I'm calling this counter But honestly, you could call it anything you want to. You could call it X, you could call it I, you could call it N. But remember, good coding usually starts with comprehensive, like variables that have meaning. I can't think right now and I can't talk. Then what's our ending condition? So while what? That doesn't look very readable. How long do we want to keep printing? Because we know our action is going to be printing, but while, oh, this is really quick. While, and then what would be our condition here? Think about our task. When do we know to stop? Very good. So while our count or counter is less than or equal to 100. So there's actually more than one answer for this. Just to list a few others, if you guys, I'm gonna write it out if I could get this to work. You could also have while counter is not equal to 101. You could do while counter is less than 101. There's like a whole bunch of other ones, but I would say this one might be the most intuitive right here, while counter is less than or equal to 100. Because we know that we want our code to keep running until we get to this point, we want to keep running until we get to 100. So while it's less than or equal to 100, you're going to perform a specific action. And what is our action going to be in this particular case? What do we want to do every single time our loop runs? Sorry, action. No, we're not quite here at the increment yet. Yes, we want to print our variable. Our variable, which is currently called counter, we could call it something else later on when we actually code it, is going to be changing every single time because, like you guys mentioned, we want to increment by 1. We want to increment counter by 1 each time. So when we first start, counter will be equal to 1. Then after that, counter will be equal to 2. Then after that, counter will be equal to 3 because we're incrementing counter each time, which means that what we're trying to print here is going to change every single time as well because counter is changing. So counter will be 1, we print 1. Counter will be 2, we print 2. Let's go ahead and code this out, and then I'm going to show you guys a walkthrough of that code so that those of you guys who are seeing loops for the first time might be a little bit more familiarized with this. All right, everyone sees this okay? Perfect. So this code right here was, printing 100 asterisk. So the next algorithm was to print 1 through 100. So we talked about our starting value, just rewriting everything. We said the starting value was going to be 1, or like counter is equal to 1. You don't have to call it counter. If you want to, we call it like X. We had an ending condition. So when we know like to stop the loop, and that would be while X or like x is less than or equal to 1. So, or sorry, not 100. So I guess you wouldn't call it like an ending condition. So as soon as it reaches past 100, then you know that you're done. So the opposite of this is while x is less than or equal to 100. Rather than calling it ending condition, we might want to call it the condition instead. So while x is less than or equal to 100, keep doing this. Then we have our action, which we said it was to print the number itself. So we wanted to print the number, and the number that is constantly changing is x. And then for incrementation, so pretty much what we're updating, we said that it should increment by 1 each time. So let's go ahead and write this all out into code. So we start with our initialization, which we established was going to be x is equal to 1. Then after that, we have our condition, which we said is going to be while x is less than or equal to 100. And then within an indented part of our code, so our code block, we are going to print this x value. After that, we update, we're going to update our value x by adding 1 to it. So if you guys are lazy like me, you don't have to write it like this, x is equal to x plus 1. You can, but there is a shorthand way to write it, and that is x plus equals 1. This just means taking x and adding 1 to it and setting that as your new x. Fortunately, there's no such thing as x plus plus in Python. So you have to use x plus equals 1. So this right here is our action. So if I save this and run it, we can see the values 1 through 100 being printed out. So like 1, 2, 3, like all of these things all the way up to 100 being printed. So let's do a quick run through as to why this happens and why it works. 1 second. So in our code, we started off with an x is equal to 1. And then we had while x is less than or equal to 100, print x. And then we had our updater x is equal to plus equals 1. This is going to serve as my console. So pretty much what is like, we'll be able to see things that print out on here. And then I'm also going to keep track of everything using my table, or like using a quick table like x. And actually just gonna, I guess there's only one thing that goes in the table, and that's x. So we'll just keep track of what x is. So right now, x is equal to 1. I am at this point right here, x is equal to 1. When I go to the next step, the next code line in the sequence, I would be here. And that means I have to verify this code while 1 is less than or equal to 100. Is this a true statement? Is 1 less than or equal to 100? Yes, it is, right? So because this is a true statement, we are going to fall into this code block and execute it, which means the first thing I do, or the first thing I see is print x. And my current x value is 1. So 1 will print out in my console. And then the next line it sees is x plus equals 1, which means I increment my x value by 1. So now my new x value is 2. Now that I've reached this bottom line, so like I've reached the end of my code block, my indented code block, I'm going to go back to the top right here to the while loop, and again, compute. Make sure that the condition is true, because if it's true, I want to go back inside of the code block. So while my new x right now, so this x right here is 2. So while 2 is less than or equal to 100, is that a true statement? Yes, it's a true statement. So because it's a true statement, it will fall into the code block again, that the thing that I designated in this red color, and then it'll check, is it, or not check, it'll run that, and it's going to print my current x value, which is 2, so 2 will print, and then it'll go to the next line, which is x plus equals 1, which means that it is going to increment 1. So my new x value is 3. Going back in, I am going to, hold on a second. It looks like my screen hasn't updated yet. Oh, there we go. So it's now that I've reached the very bottom down here, I've reached this part, I'm going to go back to the top and double check if that condition is still true. So while 3 is less than or equal to 100, is that a true statement or a false statement? It's a true statement. Very good. So because this is a true statement, it's going to go inside that block. And then it's going to print x. Currently, my x value is 3. So 3 will print, and then it'll increment x, right? Because I have the x plus equals 1 here. It'll increment x. That means my new x value is 4. And then it'll continue this pattern. So as you can see, so far we're printing 1, 2, 3 out perfectly fine. Let's skip over until, let's say, my current, I just printed out 98. Or let's just say, yeah, let's say we printed out 98. So I'm just kind of skipping ahead because I don't want to do numbers 3 through 97. So it's a lot of work. One second, let's move this over to the side. Oops. So now let's say I've finished up to 98. So currently I am at x. X is equal to, I guess x would be equal to 99 at this point. Then I go into the next line of code right here, or like I have to verify if 99 is less than or equal to 100. So I check while 99 is less than or equal to 100. Is that a true statement? Yes, this is a true statement. So because it's true, I'm going to fall into the next, I'm going to fall into like that code block, the indented code block, which is to print my x value, which is 99. So 99 will print, and then I am going to increment my x value. So now x is equal to 100. I'm going to go into this line of code now, because now that I've reached the bottom part right here where I got, where after I've incremented that x value, I go back to verify that this is true or not. And see, while 100 is less than or equal to 100, is this a true statement or a false statement? It's a true statement. Very good. So this is a true statement, which means that I'm going to go into this code block right here. The first thing I see is to print my x value, which is currently 100. So print 100. And then after that, it'll increment my x value. So now x is equal to 101. Now I'm down here. So I have to go back to the top and verify that this condition is true or not. Is 101 less than or equal to 100? This is false. So because right here we determined it's false, we break out of this loop and we're done with the loop. And that's the reason why our loop, how we wrote it, works. We had our initialization, we had our condition, the body, and then updater. And that was just everything that we needed in order to print out numbers 1 through 100. Definitely a lot easier than printing out, like than writing out the code, print 1, print 2, print 3, print 4, and so on. Does anyone have any questions up to this point? Let's try our next one, which is a little different. It's counting down from 100 to 0 this time. So once again, we need those 4 components, and I'm actually just going to change this to the ending condition. It seems like just condition, this might be a little bit easier for you guys. So let's do from 100 to 0. What would be our starting value? What would be our counter initialization, I guess? 100, good. So it looks like you guys have a specific variable in mind. So I is equal to 100. That's going to be our starting value. And you can see right here that indeed we have 100 as like the first thing we want to print. So we might as well start from 100. You don't have to start from 100. I just think it's the easiest thing to do, especially because you already have a very set starting position and a very start ending position. So this would be your start and this would be your end. Which means we could use the ending position, which is our 0, for our condition. How would we define our condition? While what? I is greater than or equal to 0. Good. This is a good one. That, like I said, there's going to be a lot of other ones that you can do. So for example, you could do while I is greater than -1. You could do while I is not equal to -1. Not, or you could even like throw in some knots in there, but this is a good one. And I'm actually going to skip over to the increment and decrement. We'll go back to the body in just a second. So because we're starting from 100 and we're going down, we're counting down to 0. How would we say, would we be incrementing? Would we be decrementing? And by how much would we be doing either? Very good. We want to decrement by 1 each time. Because you can see here it's -1, -1, -1, -1 each time. So that step right there, we could also incorporate in what we have here. Now the action or the body, what would that be? What are we going to be doing each time our loop runs? What do we need to execute, I guess? Yes, we want to print out the I value. I is our variable that is changing starting from 100 and falling down to 0. So because that is what is variable, we might as well just use that to print. We're going to go ahead and code this out as well. Alrighty. So this one right here, I'm gonna comment out. And we are going to print 100 to 0. Everyone can see this okay? Okay, perfect. So we have our starting value, and then we said that this is going to be I is equal to 1. We have our condition, which is while I is greater than or equal to 0. This time around, I'm going to test it with the different combinations or the different conditions that we had before, just to show you that there's more than one way to write a loop. We know that the action, what we want to do in here is to print I, because that is the number that is changing each time. That's a variable that represents the number. And to update everything, we know we should decrement I by 1. We need to make it go down smaller, otherwise it's going to be printing forever. So to write out this code, we have our starting. So this is our initialization, and then we need our condition. So while I is less than or equal to, sorry, greater than or equal to 0, this is our condition. Tab it, that way we know what goes inside the body, and we're gonna do a print I. And then we want to do x minus equals 1. Sorry, not x, I is minus equal 1. This is decrementing by 1, decrement by 1. This is exactly the same as I is equal to I minus 1. It's just a little shorthand because I'm a lazy person. Here we're printing I. So this is just our body. This is the action. This is what we wanted to achieve. This is what we wanted to do repeatedly without actually having to write it out repeatedly. So now that we have this, I'm going to go ahead and run it, and we can see our countdown starting from 100. We start here and we just go down all the way to 0. I mentioned a couple of other things that you could have done, so let's test those out. So I said instead of doing I is greater than or equal to 1, you could have just done I is greater than -1. And it does exactly the same thing. It's just that you can see right here, we just have a different condition. This works as well. I'm going to do a walkthrough with this one instead of greater than or equal to 0. Everyone see this okay? It's just should be a blank white screen. Okay, so we have I is equal to 100, and then I wrote while I is greater than -1, print I, and then we have I minus equals 1. We had our starting, our condition, our body, and then our decrementer in this case. Once again, my console is right here. And then we're just going to show our work over here. So this right here is our code. Whoa. So let's start with our just I is equal to 1, or I is equal to 100, because that's pretty much where our starting point is right here. That's what you always go sequentially. So I is equal to 100. Then the next step would be this while loop. So it's caught in a while loop right now, and it will continue to run that while loop until it finds an occurrence where the condition is no longer true. So with this while loop, we have while I is greater than -1. In our case, I is actually 100. So let me replace that with 100. So while 100 is greater than -1. Is this true or is this false? This is a true statement. Perfect. So this is true, which means we're going to go straight right here into our print statement. And it's going to print our current I value, which is 100. So 100 prints out, and then it will decrement I. So now I is no longer 100, I is going to be 99. Next, since we hit this, we hit down here, we are going to go back up and check the condition with our new I value. So you're going to check while 99 is greater than -1. True or false? Very good. This is a true statement. So because this is true, we're going to go inside of that body, like the indented code block, to run it and see, or just like do whatever we need to pretty much. So it's going to print out the 99 because that's our current I value. So 99 will print. And then after that, it'll decrement I. So I minus equals 1. So now our I value is 98. So I'm going to skip all the way up to, now we have printed 2. I'm going to skip to 2 pretty much. So if we print 2, then that means our current I value is equal to 1. We're up here pretty much again. So we're going to double check and see if I is greater than or equal to -1. So that means while I, or I guess 1, is greater than -1. Is that true or is that false? Very good. This is true. It's a true statement, which means we're going to go inside of this block right here. Print I. So we're going to print 1. So 1 will print. And then we're going to decrement the I. So now I is equal to 0. Going back in to check right here, because we hit the bottom, we're going to go to the top and check this condition. So we're going to check while 0 is greater than -1. Is this true or is this false? Very good. This is a true statement. So because it's true, we're going to fall back into this indented code block, and we are going to print our current I value, which is 0. So 0 will print. And then we're going to decrement our I value. So I minus equals 1. That means I is now equal to -1. Because we've reached the bottom here, we're going to go back to the top and then check our condition. So while -1 is greater than -1, is this true or is this false? Good, this is false. Because it's false, we exit this loop. We're done with the loop. No need to go down here or check this again. We are done. So this would work if you had decided to do greater than or equal to 0 instead. Oopsies. Greater than or equal to 0, this would also work. You would end up with the same results pretty much. Just that your condition would be different, but it works the same. All right, does anyone have any questions with this one? If not, then I'm gonna go into the next one. So we are here, or we just finished this one. Now we're gonna go to this one, printing even numbers from 2 to 100. Once again, I'm probably just gonna change this from ending condition to just the condition. What would our starting value be then here? where do we want to start if we want to print out from 2 to 100? 2, perfect. So we can make our starting value equal to 2. I could call this, we'll call this v is equal to 2. There's more than one way to do this. I'm going to show you guys, actually, yes. So there's 2 ways that we're going to do this. So today we're going to do only the first way, and the next time I'll show you guys the second way to do it. But we'll start with 2. Then what's our ending condition here? Where do we want to go up to, pretty much? Right, so while it is less than or equal to 100, so we want to go up to 100 and we could stop there. We don't want to exceed that. Then let's actually skip down over to here again, increment or decrement. How should we do this? Do we want to increment or do we want to decrement, and by how much? We can increment by 2, perfect. Oh, oopsies. Then what would our action be here? If we're incrementing by 2? We're just going to print that value that we obtain each time. Because you can see as we're going through, every single time we increment, we're incrementing by 2. So we're increasing our value v by 2, which means we have our new value of v, which just needs to be printed, and that's all we need. We will stop as soon as we attain 100. Hence, we have this while v is less than or equal to 100. Oops. That being said, let's go ahead and code this out. So this is printing even numbers 2 through 100. We already identified the different things that we needed. So for our starting value, we set that it was going to be 2. Oh yeah, just v is equal to 2. For the condition, we said that it's going to be while v is less than or equal to 100. And then our action, the thing that we want to do each time, is to print the newly attained number. And finally, what we want to update, we decided we need to increment instead of decrement v by 2. That way we have each new even number. So writing this all out, we have our starting, our initialization, which is v is 2. This is our initialization, or starting value. Then we have a while loop. So while v is less than or equal to 100, this is our condition. And then we have our action, what we want to do, and we would print out v each time. And then we need to update v plus equals 2. This just means increment v by 2. This would be the same thing as v is equal to v plus 2. So if I run this, you can see I start from 2 right here, and then I'm going all the way to 100, but I'm moving in intervals of 2. So 2, 4, 6, 8, and you can see down here I have 92, 98, 96, or like, sorry, 92, 94, 96, 98, and 100.